Hello, my dear adventurers. It's your midnight lawkeeper, welcoming you back to our cozy sanctuary, where the chaos of the world fades into distant whispers and tales of ancient glory come alive. Tonight, I'm particularly thrilled about our journey, for we venture into the storm-racked heart of Westeros itself, to explore one of its most fascinating and tumultuous houses. Whether you stand with the dragon or the stag, the wolf or the lion, we can all appreciate the raw power and tragedy that defines House Baratheon, whose legendary tale of thunder and fury has shaped the very foundations of the Seven Kingdoms. Imagine with me the towering fortress of Storm's End, perched upon the cliffs where Shipbreaker Bay crashes endlessly against ancient stone. Picture the massive walls, round and seamless, built to withstand the wrath of gods themselves. Feel the salt-laden wind whipping through the battlements. Hear the distant rumble of thunder rolling across darkened skies, and sense the weight of centuries pressing down upon those legendary halls. This is where our story begins, and where, through conquest and rebellion, through triumph and tragedy, the Black Stag would leave its mark upon history. So settle into your most comfortable spot, wrap yourself in warmth, and let your imagination carry you across the centuries. Before we can truly understand House Baratheon, we must first journey back through the mists of time to an age of legends, when gods walked the earth and heroes challenged the very heavens themselves. Long before the Targaryens ever set foot in Westeros with their dragons of fire and blood, before the Andals crossed the narrow sea with their seven-pointed star, the Stormlands were ruled by the Storm Kings of House Durrandon, and their story begins with a man who would dare to defy the gods themselves. The legend speaks of Doran, who would come to be known as Doran Godsgrief, the first Storm King and the builder of Storm's End. The tale goes that Doran was a mighty warrior who fell deeply in love with a woman of impossible beauty named Elenay. But Elenay was no ordinary maiden, for she was the daughter of the sea god and the goddess of the wind, beings of immense and terrible power who ruled the storms that swept across Shipbreaker Bay. When Doran and Elenay chose to wed despite her divine parents' fury, the gods unleashed their wrath upon the mortal who dared claim their daughter. On the night of their wedding, a storm of unprecedented fury descended upon Doran's castle, a tempest so violent that the sea rose up like mountains and the wind howled with the voices of the damned. The castle was obliterated, torn apart by wind and wave, and everyone within perished save for Doran and Elenay, who survived huddled together in the ruins as the storm raged around them. But Doran Godsgrief was not a man to accept defeat, even from the gods themselves. In his grief and rage at the loss of his family and people, he declared war upon the very heavens. He would build a castle so mighty, so impregnable, that not even the combined fury of the sea god and the wind goddess could tear it down. 6 times he built his fortress, and 6 times the gods sent their storms to destroy his work, reducing stone and timber to rubble and ruin. Each failure only strengthened Doran's resolve, his determination burning brighter with every setback. Some legends say that for his 7th and final attempt, Doran sought the aid of Bran the Builder, the legendary figure who raised Winterfell and the wall itself. Others claim that the children of the forest took pity on the grieving warrior and his immortal bride, lending their ancient magic to the construction. Still others whisper that Doran bargained with a young boy who would grow to become the first of the Greenseers, trading secrets and promises for magical aid. Whatever the truth, the 7th castle stood against the storm. This fortress, Storm's End, was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Its walls were not built with corners or angles that the wind could catch and exploit. Instead, they rose in a perfect, seamless circle, smooth and round as a drum. Each stone fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed. The walls were raised impossibly high and thick, capable of withstanding both the battering of waves and the screaming fury of the fiercest gales. And when the gods sent their mightiest storm yet to destroy this final attempt, the castle stood firm. The winds broke against those curved walls and dispersed. The waves crashed and fell back, and Storm's End endured. In his defiant victory over the divine tempest, Arryn earned his name God's Grief, for he had brought grief to gods themselves. He proclaimed himself the Storm King, the first of his line, having symbolically conquered the storms that had sought to destroy him. From that day forward, Storm's End stood as an eternal testament to mortal defiance and determination, a fortress that had never fallen to siege or storm in all the long centuries since its founding. House Durrandon, descended from Durran Godsgrief, would rule the Stormlands for thousands of years, passing the title of Storm King from father to son through generation after generation. They built their kingdom through strength and conquest, expanding their territory through the Cape of Wrath, the Dornish Marches, and deep into what would later become the Crownlands. The Storm Kings were fierce warriors who commanded respect and fear in equal measure, their crown stag sigil flying high over conquered lands. The last of these ancient Storm Kings would be Argilac, who history would remember as Argilac the Arrogant. By the time Argilac came to power, House Durrandon had ruled the Stormlands for so many centuries that their reign seemed eternal and unshakable. Argilac was a seasoned warrior, white-haired but still formidable, a king who had proven himself in countless battles and who ruled his domain with an iron will. But the world was changing, and from across the narrow sea, dragon lords were coming with fire and blood. The year was 2 years before the Conquest, and in the fortress of Dragonstone, Aegon Targaryen was preparing to forge a new world. With him stood his 2 sister wives, the fierce Visenya and the clever Rhaenys, along with their 3 magnificent dragons. But among Aegon's most trusted companions was a man who would become the founder of a dynasty that would eventually overthrow the Dragon Kings themselves, a warrior known as Orys Baratheon. The truth of Orys Baratheon's birth was shrouded in the whispers and speculation, but the rumors persisted throughout his life and beyond. It was said that he was the bastard son of Aeryn Targaryen, Aegon's father, born of a liaison with an unknown woman on Dragonstone. If the rumors were true, and most masters and members of House Targaryen believed they were, then Orys was Aegon's half-brother, bound to the conqueror not just by loyalty and friendship, but by blood itself. Whether the rumors of his parentage were true or not, what was undeniable was the depth of the bond between Aegon and Orys. They had been raised together, trained together, and forged a friendship that was unshakable. Orys served as Aegon's most capable general and trusted advisor, a warrior of legendary prowess and a commander of exceptional skill. When Aegon began his conquest of Westeros, it was Orys who commanded the ground forces, while the dragons ruled the skies. King Argilac the Arrogant, watching the growing power of House Targaryen with concern, sought to form an alliance before the Dragon Lords turned their eyes toward his kingdom. He sent envoys to Dragonstone with a generous offer. His only child and heir, his daughter Argella, would wed Aegon Targaryen, and as her dowry, Argilac would give all the lands east of the God's Eye, from the Trident to the Blackwater Rush. It was a tempting offer, one that would have given Aegon a strong foothold on the mainland without a drop of blood being spilled. But Aegon, already wed to both his sisters and requiring no third wife, saw an opportunity to honour his greatest friend and general. He countered with his own proposal. Argella would instead marry Orys Baratheon, and the dowry would be significantly increased to include Massey's Hook and all lands from the Blackwater south to the Wendwater and the headwaters of the Mander. To Argilac, this was an intolerable insult. He had offered his daughter to a king, to Dragon Lord royalty, and in return had been offered a bastard, a man who bore the stain of illegitimacy regardless of whose bastard he might be. The Storm King's rage was terrible to behold. He had the hands of Aegon's envoy cut off and sent them back to Dragonstone in a box, along with a message that made his position perfectly clear. These are the only hands you shall receive. It was a declaration of war, a challenge that could not be ignored. Aegon, his patience at an end, and his ambition burning bright, called his banners and sent ravens to all the kings of Westeros. His message was simple and absolute. He would be the only king in Westeros, and those who bent the knee would keep their lands and titles, while those who refused would be destroyed. Thus began Aegon's conquest, and the Storm King's rejection would seal the fate of House Durrandon. While Aegon dealt with other kingdoms, he entrusted Orys with the critical task of conquering the Stormlands. Orys was given the greater part of Aegon's host, and Rhaenys Targaryen accompanied him astride her dragon Meraxes, their combined might a force that should have been overwhelming. But Argilac the Arrogant had not earned his name through cowardice. He was a cunning strategist who had learned from the fate of Harren the Black at Harrenhal, where the mightiest fortress in Westeros had been turned into a funeral pyre by dragonfire. Argilac knew that if he cowered behind the impregnable walls of Storm's End, the dragons would simply fly overhead and burn him out like a rat from its hole. Instead, he made a bold decision. He would meet Orys in open battle, choosing his ground carefully and timing his attack to minimize the dragon's advantage. The Storm King gathered his bannermen to Storm's End, and his army was formidable, twice the size of Orys' force. Lords Errol, Fell, and Buckler led the Storm King's van, and they struck first, surprising Orys' advance elements as they crossed the Wendwater. More than 1,000 men fell in that initial ambush before the Baratheon forces could regroup and retreat. It was a strong start for the Storm King, but the true test was yet to come. The battle that would decide the fate of the Stormlands came to be known as the Last Storm, and it was fought in conditions that Argilac had specifically chosen. He waited for one of the massive thunderstorms that gave his kingdom its name, a tempest with lightning splitting the sky and rain falling in sheets so thick that visibility was measured in yards rather than miles. In such conditions, it was far too dangerous for Meraxes to fly, and the dragon's advantage would be neutralized. When the armies clashed, it was everything a battle should be, brutal and chaotic and desperate. The Storm King's forces, larger and fighting on familiar ground, initially had the advantage. During their third charge, the Stormlander Knights broke through Orys' center, and for a moment, it seemed that the battle might turn decisively in Argilac's favor. But Rhaenys Targaryen was not content to let her dragon remain grounded. She mounted Meraxes and had the great beast walk into battle on foot, breathing fire even without the advantage of flight. The dragon flame turned the tide. The Storm King's personal guard, the finest knights of the Stormlands, were consumed in an instant, their armor melting, their screams lost in the roar of flames. Horses panicked and threw their riders, men fled in terror, and the orderly charge dissolved into chaos. King Argilac himself was thrown from his horse, but refused to yield or flee. When the flames had passed, and Orys Baratheon came riding down the muddy hill with his men, he found the old Storm King still fighting, holding off half a dozen attackers with as many corpses already at his feet. Orys dismounted so that he could meet the king on equal footing, offering Argilac one final chance to yield and save his life. The old warrior's response was a curse, defiant to the very end. And so they fought, the grizzled white-haired Storm King and Aegon's fierce black-bearded general, fighting in the mud and rain as the battle raged around them. Both men took wounds in that duel, steel finding flesh on both sides. But in the end, it was Orys who emerged victorious. The last of the Durandons died as he had lived, with a sword in his hand and a curse on his lips. The death of their king broke the spirit of the Stormlanders. Those who had not already fled threw down their swords and surrendered, the centuries-old reign of House Durandon ending in blood and rain at the place that would forever after be known as the Last Storm. But the story of the Stormlands was far from over, for Argilac's daughter Argella refused to accept defeat. When word reached Storm's end of her father's death, Princess Argella Durandon barred the gates and declared herself the Storm Queen. When Rhaenys flew Meraxes to the castle to parley, Argella stood firm on the battlements and announced that the defenders of Storm's End would die to the last man, rather than surrender. It was a brave declaration, filled with the defiance of her house, but her garrison did not share her willingness to face the same fate as Harrenhal. That night, the soldiers and servants of Storm's End, having no desire to burn, mutinied against their self-proclaimed queen. They raised a peace banner, threw open the castle gates, and delivered Lady Argella to Orys's camp. In an act of cruel humiliation, they brought her to him gagged, chained and naked, a broken princess stripped of her dignity along with her power. But Orys Baratheon was no cruel conqueror. The reports of what happened next speak to the character of the man who would found this great house. Orys himself removed Argella's chains, wrapped his own cloak around her to preserve her modesty, and spoke to her gently of her father's courage and the honourable manner of his death. He treated her with respect and kindness, and in time, something remarkable happened. The conquered princess and her conqueror came to understand one another, and eventually, Argella agreed to become Orys's wife. To honour the fallen Storm King, and to cement his rule over the Stormlands, Orys made a decision that would echo through the centuries. He adopted the sigil of House Durandon as his own, a crowned black stag on a golden field. He also took their words, "Ours is the fury," as his house motto. In doing so, he was not trying to erase House Durandon, but rather to honour it, to show that while the Storm Kings had fallen, their legacy would continue through this new house that bore their symbols. Aegon Targaryen rewarded his friend's loyalty and success magnificently. He named Orys Baratheon the Lord of Storm's End and Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, making him one of the most powerful men in the new Seven Kingdoms. But Aegon gave Orys an even greater honour. He appointed him as the first hand of the king, the position that would become the second most powerful office in the realm. Orys served Aegon faithfully in this role, helping to administer the newly conquered kingdoms and proving himself as capable in peace as he had been in war. The founding of House Baratheon was thus accomplished, born from the ashes of House Durandon in fire and blood, and tempered by honor and respect. Orys and Argella would have children, beginning a new dynasty that carried both the blood of the ancient Storm Kings and, if the rumors were true, the blood of the dragon as well. For nearly 300 years, House Baratheon served House Targaryen with unwavering loyalty, standing as one of the great pillars supporting the Iron Throne. The Baratheons were the storm and the fury, the military might, that the Dragon Kings could call upon in times of crisis. Yet this long era of service was not without its trials, its triumphs, and its tribulations that would shape the house for generations to come. Orys Baratheon's later years were marked by both glory and tragedy. During the First Dornish War, when Aegon sought to bring the unconquered kingdom of Dorne under his rule, Orys led Targaryen forces into the unforgiving deserts and mountains of the south. The Dornish fought differently than any foe Orys had faced before, using guerrilla tactics and refusing to meet the Targaryens in open battle where dragons could decide the outcome. It was during this bitter conflict that Orys was captured by the Will of Will, one of Dorne's most notorious lords. The Will of Will was known for his cruelty, and he did not simply imprison the First Lord Baratheon. In a calculated act of humiliation, he cut off Orys's sword hand, the hand that had slain Argilac the Arrogant, the hand that had wielded blade and banner for Aegon the Conqueror. When Orys was finally ransomed and returned, he was a changed man, embittered and crabbed, his fighting days seemingly over. He could no longer serve as Hand of the King, and he resigned from the position, convinced that a one-handed man could no longer fulfill the duties of such high office. But the loss of his hand did not diminish Orys's courage or his thirst for vengeance. The humiliation festered, and Orys, now known as Orys One Hand, became obsessed with returning to Dorne and reclaiming his honor. Eventually, he got his chance. When conflict with Dorne flared again, Orys led another expedition south, determined to face the Will of Will in single combat. Despite his disability, Orys fought and killed the man who had maimed him, and in a grim echo of his own mutilation, he cut off the dead lord's sword hand and brought it back as a trophy. It was a dark victory, but it proved that even one-handed, a Baratheon was still a force to be reckoned with. Orys's descendants would continue to serve the Targaryens with distinction through the generations. His son Davos inherited Storm's End and the lordship of the Stormlands, continuing the line that would span centuries. Among the notable Baratheons who followed was Rhaegar Baratheon, Orys's grandson, who would rise to become one of the most powerful men in the realm. Lord Rhaegar Baratheon served as Hand of the King to Jaehaerys I, the Old King, one of the longest reigning and most successful Targaryen monarchs. Rhaegar was a formidable figure in his own right, a skilled warrior and cunning political operator. In a match that cemented the bonds between the two houses even further, Rhaegar married Dowager Queen Alyssa Valerian, the widow of King Innis and mother to King Jaehaerys. Through this marriage, Rhaegar could boast, as he often did, that both the blood of the dragon and the blood of the ancient Storm Kings flowed through his veins. The intermarriage between houses Targaryen and Baratheon would become a recurring theme throughout their shared history. These unions served both political and practical purposes, strengthening alliances and, for the Targaryens at least, providing additional Valyrian bloodlines that might help preserve their unique abilities and characteristics. One of the most significant of these marriages would come during the reign of Jaehaerys I, when his son and heir, Prince Aemon, married Jocelyn Baratheon. Prince Aemon and Jocelyn's union produced a daughter, Rhaenys Targaryen, who would become known to history as the Queen Who Never Was. Rhaenys was beloved by the people and widely expected to inherit the Iron Throne after her father. But when Prince Aemon died before his father King Jaehaerys, a succession crisis erupted. The Great Council of 101 after Conquest was called to decide between Rhaenys and Jaehaerys' second son, Balon. The council chose Balon, not because he was more capable or more beloved, but simply because he was male, establishing a precedent that would haunt the Targaryen dynasty for generations to come. During the cataclysmic civil war, known as the Dance of the Dragons, House Baratheon found itself playing a crucial role once again. When the realms split between those who supported Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen and those who backed her half-brother King Aegon II, the Stormlands had to choose sides. Lord Boros Baratheon, who ruled Storm's End at that time, was known to be somewhat vain and easily swayed by flattery. He also had a significant weakness. At least according to some accounts, he could barely read. When Prince Lucerys Velaryon arrived at Storm's End, bearing a message from Rhaenyra, seeking Boros's allegiance, he arrived to find Prince Aemon Targaryen already there, representing King Aegon. The scene that unfolded in Storm's End's Great Hall would have far-reaching consequences. Boros, after having Rhaenyra's letter read to him and finding it lacking in concrete offers or inducements, was further swayed when Aemon offered to marry one of Boros's daughters. The Lord of Storm's End declared for King Aegon, and when Lucerys turned to leave, disaster struck. Prince Aemon, seeking revenge for the loss of his eye years earlier, pursued Lucerys out into the storm. What followed was a dragon battle over Shipbreaker Bay, where Aemon's massive dragon Vhagar killed both Lucerys and his much smaller dragon Arrax, an act that escalated the Dance of the Dragons into full-blown war. Lord Boros would later come to regret his choice, particularly when he faced the consequences of backing the losing side. During the later stages of the dance, Boros Baratheon led his forces in battle, but he made a critical error that would prove fatal. He consistently underestimated his female opponents, dismissing them as less capable simply because of their gender. When a force led by women commanders marched to meet him, Boros was ill-prepared, having not taken the threat seriously. The Battle of the King's Road that followed saw Boros Baratheon killed in combat, his army defeated, and his house's military strength temporarily shattered. Despite this setback, House Baratheon recovered and continued to serve the Targaryens faithfully for another century and a half. Another significant Baratheon to appear in the historical record was Lyonel Baratheon, known as the Laughing Storm. Lyonel earned his colourful nickname during a rebellion he staged against King Aegon V, though the circumstances that led to that rebellion were hardly amusing. King Aegon V, also known as Aegon the Unlikely, was a reformer who sought to improve the lot of the common people, often at the expense of the Great Lord's privileges. His son, Prince Duncan, was betrothed to one of Lyonel Baratheon's daughters, a match that would have brought great honour to House Baratheon. However, Prince Duncan fell in love with a common woman, known as Jenny of Oldstones, and, in a shocking breach of duty and tradition, broke his betrothal to marry her instead. Lyonel Baratheon, his house insulted and his daughter humiliated, raised his banners in rebellion. He renounced his allegiance to House Targaryen and even went so far as to declare himself the Storm King, claiming the ancient title of his house's predecessors. It was a bold and dangerous move, harking back to the days before the Conquest, when House Durrandon had ruled independently. The rebellion might have turned bloody, but King Aegon, ever the peacemaker, found a way to resolve the conflict without massive bloodshed. He sent Sir Duncan the Tall, the Lord Commander of his Kingsguard, and the man for whom Prince Duncan was named, to face Lionel in single combat. The trial by combat was fierce, with both men proving their worth as warriors, but in the end, Sir Duncan prevailed. Rather than executing Lionel or stripping his house of its honours, King Aegon offered a new betrothal to mend the breach. His daughter, Princess Rhaelle Targaryen, would marry Lionel's heir, Ormond Baratheon. Lionel accepted, the rebellion ended, and peace was restored. This marriage would prove to be one of the most consequential in the history of both houses, for Princess Rhaelle and Ormond would have a son named Steffon, and Steffon would father 3 sons who would tear the realm apart: Robert, Stannis, and Renly Baratheon. Through all these generations, through wars and peace, triumphs and setbacks, House Baratheon remained one of the staunchest supporters of Targaryen rule. They commanded armies, governed the Stormlands with strength and justice, and intermarried with the Dragon Kings to such an extent that Targaryen blood flowed through Baratheon veins. Yet this long era of loyal service would eventually come to a catastrophic end, brought about by the madness of one king and the grief and rage of one young lord. The seeds of Robert's rebellion were sown in the tragic deaths of Lord Steffon Baratheon and his wife Cassana, who perished when their ship broke apart on the rocks within sight of Storm's End, as they returned from a mission to Volantis. Their 3 sons, Robert, Stannis, and Renly, were left orphaned, with Robert inheriting his father's titles as the new Lord of Storm's End and Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, while still a young man. Robert Baratheon grew into a figure of legend even before the rebellion that would make him king. He was tall and powerfully built, with the characteristic Baratheon black hair and deep blue eyes. In his youth, Robert was everything a lord should be: a fearsome warrior who wielded a warhammer with devastating effect, a skilled hunter, a charismatic leader who inspired loyalty and friendship wherever he went. He was fostered at the Eyrie by Lord Jon Arryn, alongside Eddard Stark, the son of the Warden of the North, and the 2 young men became as close as brothers. Robert fell deeply in love with Eddard's younger sister, Lyanna Stark, a spirited and beautiful young woman who was said to be as skilled with a sword as any knight. When Robert and Lyanna were betrothed, it seemed like a perfect match. The Lord of Storm's End and the daughter of Winterfell, 2 great houses united. But fate and the obsessions of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen would shatter that dream and plunge the realm into war. The tourney at Harrenhal in the year of the Fall Spring was one of the grandest events in living memory, drawing lords and ladies from across the 7 kingdoms. It was there that the seeds of disaster were truly planted. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, heir to the Iron Throne and married to Elia Martell of Dorne, won the tournament's joust and was given the honour of crowning the Queen of Love and Beauty. To everyone's shock and horror, Rhaegar passed over his own wife and placed a crown of winter roses in Lyanna Stark's lap instead. The implications of this act rippled through the assembled nobility like a stone thrown into still water. Lyanna was betrothed to Robert Baratheon, and Rhaegar was married to a Dornish princess. The crown of roses was a public statement of affection, of desire, and it dishonoured both Elia Martell and Robert Baratheon. Some whispered that Robert laughed it off, claiming the prince was merely paying Lyanna her due. Others insisted that Robert was furious, that the slight cut deep and created a lasting grudge against the Silver Prince. The truth of Robert's reaction may never be fully known, but what followed would change everything. Approximately a year after the tourney, Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark disappeared together. The official story, the one that Robert believed with every fibre of his being, was that Rhaegar had kidnapped Lyanna, abducting her against her will and hiding her away somewhere in the realm. The truth, as would only be revealed years later, was that Lyanna had gone with Rhaegar willingly, that they had fallen in love and had even married in secret. But at the time, all anyone knew was that the Crown Prince had taken the daughter of the Warden of the North, and war seemed inevitable. Lyanna's eldest brother, Brandon Stark, was on his way to River Run to marry Catelyn Tully when he heard the news. Hot-headed and impulsive, Brandon immediately rode for King's Landing with a small group of companions, arriving at the Red Keep and shouting for Rhaegar to come out and die. It was a rash act, understandable given the circumstances, but tragically foolish. Rhaegar was not in King's Landing, but the Mad King Aerys II most certainly was, and he did not take kindly to armed men demanding the death of his son. King Aerys arrested Brandon and his companions on charges of plotting to kill Prince Rhaegar, calling it treason. He then summoned Brandon's father, Lord Rickard Stark, the Warden of the North, to King's Landing to answer for his son's crimes. What followed was one of the most horrific episodes in the long, dark reign of the Mad King, an act so cruel and unjust that it would be remembered for generations as the spark that lit the fire of rebellion. When Lord Rickard Stark arrived in King's Landing to ransom his son, he expected some form of justice, some opportunity to plead his case or pay compensation. Instead, Aerys had both father and son brought before the throne room. Lord Rickard was suspended from the rafters in his armour while a fire was lit beneath him, essentially cooking him alive inside his own steel. Brandon was bound with a Tyroshi device around his neck, placed just far enough from his father that he couldn't reach him. As Brandon struggled to save his father, the device strangled him, and he died watching Rickard burn. It was an atrocity that shocked even those who had grown accustomed to Aerys's madness. But the Mad King was not finished. With Rickard and Brandon dead, Aerys sent word to Lord John Arryn at the Eyrie, demanding that he send him the heads of his two wards, Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark, who was now Lord of Winterfell following his father and brother's murders. John Arryn, who had raised both young men as his own sons, faced an impossible choice, but for him there was no choice at all. Rather than betray his wards and see them executed for crimes they had not committed, Lord Arryn raised his banners in open rebellion against the Iron Throne. This moment, this decision by John Arryn to choose honour and justice over obedience to a mad king, is considered by most historians to be the true beginning of Robert's rebellion. John sent Robert back to Storm's End to rally the Stormlands and sent Eddard north to call the banners of the North. The three great houses of Arryn, Stark and Baratheon were now in open revolt, but they would need more allies if they hoped to succeed against the might of the Iron Throne. The answer came through marriage. Eddard Stark rode to River Run and married Catelyn Tully, who had been meant for his brother Brandon. John Arryn married her sister Lysa Tully, securing the allegiance of House Tully and the Riverlands to their cause. With the North, the Vale, the Stormlands, and the Riverlands united, The rebels had a chance, but victory was far from certain. Not all of Robert's bannermen immediately flocked to his cause. Many Stormlords remained loyal to the Targaryens, or were uncertain which side would prevail. Robert had to fight for the loyalty of his own vassals, cutting his way through those who opposed him. The battles at Summerhall saw Robert crushing the Targaryen loyalists among the Stormlords, proving his military prowess and his determination. His forces then had to march north through the Reach, where they faced the army of Lord Randall Tarley, one of the finest military commanders in Westeros, at the Battle of Ashford. At Ashford, Robert's forces were defeated, suffering significant casualties and forcing the young lord to withdraw toward the Riverlands and his allies. But defeat, even a tactical one, did not break Robert's spirit. He regrouped, gathering his strength, and continued to fight. The next major engagement came at Stony Sept, a town in the southern Riverlands, where Robert was recuperating from wounds sustained in earlier fighting. Lord John Connington, Hand of the King, and one of Prince Rhaegar's closest friends, led a royal army to Stony Sept, with orders to capture or kill Robert Baratheon. Connington's forces occupied the town and searched house by house for the rebel lord. But the small folk of Stony Sept, moved by Robert's charisma, and perhaps inspired by the justice of his cause, hid him from the searching soldiers. The Battle of the Bells, as it came to be known, because the town's bells rang throughout the fighting as a warning, became a turning point in the war. As Connington's forces searched the town, the combined armies of the North, Vale and Riverlands arrived under the command of Eddard Stark and Jon Arryn. The rebels attacked, and in the fierce battle that followed, they drove Connington's forces from the town. Robert emerged from hiding to fight alongside his rescuers, and the royal army was forced to retreat. The defeat at Stony Sept finally convinced King Aerys of the seriousness of the rebellion. For too long, he had dismissed Robert and his allies as little more than uppity lords who could be easily crushed. The Mad King removed John Connington from his position as Hand and summoned Prince Rhaegar from wherever he had been hiding with Lyanna Stark. Rhaegar, who had been absent for most of the rebellion, finally emerged and took command of the royal forces, gathering an army to end the rebellion once and for all. The stage was set for the climactic confrontation that would decide the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Two armies, two philosophies, two futures for Westeros were about to collide at a river crossing that would forever after be known as the Ruby Ford. The young lord with his warhammer and the Silver Prince with his prophecies were about to meet in single combat, and only one would survive. The year was 283 after the Conquest, and the realm held its breath as two massive armies converged on the banks of the Trident, the great river that winds through the heart of the Riverlands. On one side stood the rebel forces, the combined might of four kingdoms united under the leadership of Robert Baratheon, Eddard Stark, Jon Arryn, and Hoster Tully. On the other side marched the royal army, commanded by Crown Prince Rhaegar Targaryen himself, consisting of forces from the Crownlands and 10,000 Dornish men, led by Prince Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard. The rebel army was battle-hardened, bloodied from months of fighting across the Riverlands and the Stormlands. They had faced defeat at Ashford, triumph at the Battle of the Bells, and countless smaller skirmishes. They knew each other's strengths, trusted their commanders implicitly, and fought with the righteous fury of men who had seen friends and family murdered by a mad king. Among their ranks marched men from House Bolton, Karstark, Manderley, Umber, Mallister, Corbray, and dozens of other proud houses, all united in their determination to end Targaryen rule. The royal forces were larger and fresher, having been newly assembled, but they lacked the experience and unity of their opponents. Many of the soldiers from the Crown Lands fought out of duty rather than passion, and the Dornish presence was only assured because Aerys held Elia Martell and her children hostage in King's Landing, guaranteeing her brother's compliance. The bulk of the Reach's strength was absent, tied down laying siege to Storm's End, where Stannis Baratheon and a garrison of men held out against starvation and the overwhelming forces of Lord Mace Tyrell. As the two armies faced each other across the ford, Robert Baratheon stood at the forefront of his forces, his massive warhammer in hand. The weapon had been forged specifically for him, a brutal implement of war that could crush armor and bone with equal ease. Robert himself cut an imposing figure, tall and powerful, black-bearded and fierce, every inch the warrior king he would become. On the opposite bank, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen was a study in contrast. Tall and elegant with silver-gold hair, wearing elaborate armor set with rubies, he looked every bit the noble prince of song and story. The battle began with a thunderous clash as thousands of men charged into the river, the water churning red with blood as steel met flesh. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, with no quarter asked or given. Men slipped on the blood-slick stones of the riverbed. Horses screamed and thrashed in the current, and the air filled with the sounds of battle, the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, the roar of commanders trying to make themselves heard above the chaos. For hours, the battle raged, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The rebels fought with desperate determination, knowing that defeat would mean the end of their cause, and likely their lives. The royalists fought to preserve the dynasty that had ruled for nearly 300 years, to protect their families and their king. The trident ran red with the blood of both sides as the sun climbed higher in the sky. And then, in the middle of the river, surrounded by fighting men and dying horses, Robert Baratheon and Rhaegar Targaryen came face to face. The battle around them seemed to pause, or perhaps it's merely legend that makes it seem so, as the two men who represented the old world and the new prepared to decide the realm's fate through single combat. Rhaegar was a skilled warrior, trained from birth in the arts of combat, elegant and precise with his blade. But Robert was something else entirely. Raw power and fury given human form. A warrior in his absolute prime who had been fighting battle after battle for months. When they clashed, it was fire and ice, grace and brutality, the last prince of the dragon and the stag, who would be king. The duel was fierce and swift. Rhaegar's sword found its mark more than once, drawing blood from the Baratheon lord, but Robert pressed forward relentlessly, his warhammer swinging in great arcs that Rhaegar had to desperately avoid. And then, with a blow that echoed across the battlefield like a crack of thunder, Robert's warhammer struck Rhaegar's breastplate directly over the heart. The rubies that decorated Rhaegar's armor exploded outward from the force of the impact, scattering into the river like drops of frozen blood. The crown prince fell, mortally wounded, sinking to his knees in the water of the trident. As he died, witnesses claimed they heard him murmur a woman's name, though whether it was Elia or Lyanna, no one could say for certain. The last prince of Dragonstone died there in the river, his blood mingling with that of thousands of others, and with him died the hopes of House Targaryen. The royal forces, seeing their prince fall, lost heart. Some fought on with desperate courage, particularly the Dornish men, who knew what fate awaited their princess if the rebellion succeeded. Prince Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard was cut down even as he fought to rally his men. But for most of the royal army, Rhaegar's death marked the end. They broke and fled, pursued by the vengeful rebels who had just won the Seven Kingdoms. The ford where the duel took place would forever after be known as the Ruby Ford, for in the years and decades that followed, small folk and treasure hunters would still occasionally find rubies from Rhaegar's shattered armor in the riverbed. Each discovery was a reminder of the day the dragon fell and the stag rose triumphant. Robert Baratheon, wounded but victorious, had won his war on that bloody ford. The Battle of the Trident was the decisive engagement of the rebellion, the moment when the Targaryen dynasty's hold on the Iron Throne was broken beyond repair. But the war was not quite over, and what followed in its aftermath would stain the victory with horrors that Robert would never fully escape. News of Rhaegar's death and the disaster at the Trident reached King's Landing, where the Mad King still sat upon the Iron Throne. In his paranoia and madness, Aerys ordered his pyromancers to place caches of wildfire throughout the city. If he could not rule, he would burn King's Landing to ash and take everyone with him, enemy and ally alike. Burn them all, he repeated over and over, his madness complete. Lord Tywin Lannister, who had remained neutral throughout most of the rebellion, finally chose a side. With the rebels victorious and Rhaegar dead, Tywin brought 12,000 men to King's Landing, claiming to come to the king's defense. Aerys, trusting his old friend despite his advisor's warnings, had the gates opened. It was a fatal mistake. The sack of King's Landing that followed was a brutal affair. Lannister soldiers poured through the streets, killing, looting and raping in an orgy of violence. In the Red Keep, Sir Gregor Clegane, following Tywin's orders, murdered Princess Rhaenys and Prince Aegon, Rhaegar's children, along with their mother, Elia Martell. The deaths were particularly brutal. The baby Aegon was smashed against a wall. Rhaenys was dragged from under her father's bed and stabbed multiple times, and Elia was raped and killed. Meanwhile, in the throne room, a young Kingsguard knight named Jaime Lannister made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sworn to protect the king, Jaime had listened to Aerys's mad commands, had watched him plot to burn the city and everyone in it. When Aerys ordered Jaime to bring him the head of Jaime's own father, the young knight had finally had enough. He drew his sword and killed the Mad King, stabbing him in the back and then cutting his throat to ensure he could never give the order to light the wildfire. When Eddard Stark arrived in King's Landing at the head of his forces, he found Jaime Lannister sitting on the Iron Throne. The Mad King's body slumped at its base. Later, when Robert arrived and Tywin presented him with the bodies of Elia and her children wrapped in Lannister crimson cloaks, Robert was pleased, seeing it as justice for Rhaegar's crimes against Lyanna. Eddard, horrified by the murder of children, argued with his friend, and the two had such a fierce disagreement that Eddard rode away in anger to fight the final battles of the war alone. While the rebellion appeared to be over with the fall of King's Landing, two crucial events remained unresolved. Storm's End was still under siege by the forces of House Tyrell, with Stannis Baratheon and his garrison reduced to near starvation. And somewhere in Dorne, Lyanna Stark remained missing, the woman whose disappearance had sparked the entire war. Stannis Baratheon's defense of Storm's End had become the stuff of legend. For the better part of a year, he and his men had endured the siege, eating their horses, then cats and dogs, then rats. They boiled their leather boots for sustenance and watched men die of starvation and disease. But Stannis refused to yield, holding the castle with iron determination, even when surrender would have been the rational choice. His garrison loved him not, for Stannis was never a man who inspired affection, but they respected his unbreakable will and have followed him to the edge of death and beyond. It was Davos Seaworth, a smuggler, who saved Storm's End from falling. Davos slipped through the Tyrell blockade with a small ship carrying onions and salt fish, bringing the food that would keep the garrison alive just a little longer. When the rebellion ended and the siege was lifted, Stannis would reward Davos by knighting him and granting him lands and a keep. But Stannis, being Stannis, also punished the crime of smuggling by personally cutting off the fingertips of Davos's left hand. Justice and reward, mercy and punishment, all measured precisely on Stannis's unforgiving scales. The search for Lyanna Stark led Eddard to a place in Dorne known as the Tower of Joy, a remote fortress in the Red Mountains. There, 3 of the Kingsguard's finest knights stood guard: Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, and perhaps the greatest knight of his age, Sir Oswell Went, and Lord Commander Gerald Hightower. These men had remained at their posts even as their king died, as their prince fell, and as their dynasty crumbled. The fight that followed has passed into legend, though only 2 men survived to tell the tale. Eddard Stark brought 6 companions, including his friend Howland Reed, and they fought the 3 Kingsguard in a battle that left only Eddard and Howland alive. Inside the tower, Eddard found his sister Lyanna, dying in a bed of blood. She made Eddard promise something, the details of which would remain secret for years, and then she died in his arms, the woman whose disappearance had caused so much death and suffering. Eddard tore down the Tower of Joy and built 8 cairns for the dead men, friend and foe alike. He rode to Starfall to return Arthur Dayne's legendary sword Dawn to the knight's sister, Ashara Dayne, who would throw herself from a tower into the sea shortly after. And Eddard rode north with a secret that he would keep for the rest of his life, claiming Lyanna's son as his own bastard, naming him Jon Snow to hide the truth of his Targaryen heritage from Robert's wrath. With these final loose ends resolved, the rebellion was truly over. House Targaryen was defeated, with only the pregnant Queen Rhaella and her young son Viserys escaping to Dragonstone before fleeing into exile across the narrow sea. Robert Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, was crowned King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, establishing a new dynasty to rule the 7 kingdoms. Robert Baratheon's ascension to the Iron Throne created something unprecedented in the history of House Baratheon. 3 branches of the same house, each ruling from a different seat of power. Robert himself established House Baratheon of King's Landing, ruling from the Red Keep as the new king. His younger brother Stannis was given Dragonstone, the ancient seat of House Targaryen, creating House Baratheon of Dragonstone. And the youngest brother, Renly, who had been only a child during the rebellion, became Lord of Storm's End, maintaining the original House Baratheon of Storm's End. To cement his claim and unite the kingdoms more firmly, Robert married Cersei Lannister, the daughter of Lord Tywin. It was a political match designed to reward Tywin's support and bind the wealthiest house in Westeros to the new regime. But it was a loveless marriage from the start. On their wedding night, Robert came to the bedchamber drunk and whispered, "Lyanna," in Cersei's ear, mistaking his new bride for his dead love. Cersei would never forgive that humiliation, and the marriage would become a cold war that would eventually destroy the Baratheon dynasty. As king, Robert proved to be far better as a warrior and battlefield commander than as a peacetime ruler. He had won the throne through his prowess with a warhammer and his ability to inspire men to follow him into battle. But the day-to-day governance of 7 kingdoms bored him to tears. He left the actual ruling to his hand, Jon Arryn, and his small council, while Robert himself devoted his time to hunting, drinking, and pursuing women. The realm enjoyed peace and prosperity during most of Robert's 17-year reign, but this was more despite the king than because of him. Robert spent money like water, hosting elaborate tournaments and feasts that drained the royal treasury. He fathered numerous bastards throughout the realm, acknowledged and unacknowledged, while his marriage to Cersei produced 3 children, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen. What Robert didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that none of these children were his. They were instead the products of an incestuous relationship between Cersei and her twin brother, Jaime Lannister. 8 years into his reign, Robert faced his only significant military challenge when Balon Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands, declared himself King of the Iron Islands and launched raids against the mainland. The Greyjoy rebellion was crushed relatively quickly through the combined efforts of the royal forces and Robert's old allies. Stannis Baratheon commanded the royal fleet and destroyed the Iron Fleet in a brilliant naval victory, while Eddard Stark and Robert led the ground forces that eventually took the Iron Islands' stronghold of Pike. The relationship between the 3 Baratheon brothers during this time was complex and often strained. Robert loved both his brothers in his way, but he often took them for granted and failed to show them the appreciation they deserved. Stannis, in particular, felt overlooked and undervalued. He had held Storm's End through starvation and siege, saving it for his brother, and his reward was Dragonstone, a position he saw as a slight rather than an honor. He believed Storm's End should have been his, and giving it to Renly, who had contributed nothing to the rebellion, was an insult he never forgot. Renly, by contrast, was everything Stannis was not: charming, well-liked, handsome, and skilled at courtly politics. He served as Master of Laws on Robert's small council and was popular with both the nobility and the common folk. Where Stannis was rigid and humorless, Renly was witty and amiable. The 2 brothers could not have been more different, and the resentment between them simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right spark to ignite it into open conflict. As Robert's reign continued, the king himself grew fat and slovenly, the magnificent warrior of his youth buried under layers of dissipation and indulgence. He drank heavily, ate to excess, and chased after anything in skirts while his wife grew to hate him, and his realm's finances spiraled into ever greater debt. The tournament he hosted to celebrate Jon Arryn's appointment as Hand cost a fortune. His hunting expeditions were legendary in their expense, and all the while, the crown borrowed more and more money from the Iron Bank of Braavos and from Tywin Lannister. The seeds of the Baratheon dynasty's destruction were sown not by external enemies, but by secrets and lies within the royal family itself. Jon Arryn and Stannis Baratheon had begun to suspect the truth about Cersei's children, conducting investigations into the lineages of past Baratheons and discovering that the seed is strong, that Baratheon traits, particularly the black hair, always dominated when Baratheons married into other houses. Every one of Robert's bastards had the Baratheon look, black of hair and strong of build. Yet all 3 of Cersei's children were golden-haired, green-eyed Lannisters through and through. Before John Arryn could reveal his discoveries to Robert, he was poisoned by his own wife Lysa, at the urging of Peter Baelish, who was orchestrating events from the shadows to create chaos. His death brought Eddard Stark to King's Landing as the new hand of the king, and Eddard would continue the investigation, eventually discovering the same terrible truth. Joffrey was not Robert's son, and had no legitimate claim to the Iron Throne. Robert's death came not in glorious battle, but on a hunting trip, gored by a wild boar while drunk on wine that had been fortified by his squire at Cersei's orders. As he lay dying, Robert spoke to Eddard of the realm, of his children, and asked his old friend to help his son be a better man than Robert himself had been. He never knew that his son was not his son at all, that his friend was concealing the truth even as Robert drew his last breaths. With Robert's death, the Baratheon dynasty of King's Landing had lasted barely 17 years, and it was about to tear itself apart in a succession crisis that would plunge the realm into the most devastating civil war since the Dance of the Dragons. The death of King Robert Baratheon created a succession crisis of unprecedented complexity, as 5 different men claimed royal titles and plunged the 7 kingdoms into war. 3 of those 5 claimants were Baratheons, and 2 of them were brothers who would fight each other to the death for the right to sit the Iron Throne. In King's Landing, Joffrey Baratheon was crowned king, backed by his mother Cersei and the wealth and power of House Lannister. Most of the realm did not yet know the truth about his parentage, though rumours were beginning to spread. Joffrey, young and cruel and utterly unsuited for rule, would prove to be a disaster as a monarch, his sadistic tendencies and poor judgment alienating even his own supporters. On Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon knew the truth about Joffrey's parentage and declared himself the rightful king of Westeros. By law and tradition, with Robert dead and his children bastards born of incest, Stannis was indeed the legitimate heir to the Iron Throne. He had right on his side, but precious little else. The lords of the Narrow Sea, those sworn to Dragonstone, numbered only a few thousand men. Stannis's dour personality and rigid nature had won him few friends over the years, and even his own bannermen from the Stormlands showed little enthusiasm for his cause. Into this mix came Melisandre of Ashai, a red priestess of R'hllor, the Lord of Light. Melisandre believed that Stannis was Azor Ahai reborn, a legendary hero from her religion who was prophesied to save the world from darkness. She brought strange magic and stranger beliefs to Stannis' court, and the stern lord found himself increasingly under her influence, even taking her as his mistress and abandoning the faith of the Seven for her foreign god. At Storm's End, Renly Baratheon looked at the situation and made a decision that defied all tradition and law. Despite Stannis having the better claim, despite being the younger brother, Renly declared himself king of the 7 kingdoms. His reasoning was simple but compelling. Inheritance law had not mattered when Robert overthrew the Targaryens, so why should it matter now? Robert had taken the throne because he could, and Renly believed he could do the same. What Renly lacked in legal right, he made up for in support. The Stormlords, given a choice between the stern Stannis and the charismatic Renly, overwhelmingly chose Renly. Even more crucially, Renly secured the backing of House Tyrell of the Reach by marrying Margaery Tyrell, daughter of Lord Mace Tyrell. This alliance gave Renly the combined might of the Stormlands and the Reach, by far the largest army in Westeros. With 100,000 men at his back, Renly seemed unstoppable. Stannis, watching his younger brother steal his birthright and his own bannermen, felt the old resentments burning brighter than ever. Not only had Robert given Storm's End to Renly instead of him, but now Renly was using that position to usurp what was rightfully Stannis's. It was intolerable, unforgivable, and Stannis resolved to deal with his brother before turning his attention to the Lannisters in King's Landing. With only a few thousand men, Stannis sailed to Storm's End and laid siege to the castle, forcing Renly to confront him. Renly, confident in his vastly superior numbers, rode from Bitterbridge with 20,000 knights to break the siege and crush his brother's army. Catelyn Stark, sent by her son Robb to negotiate an alliance with whichever Baratheon proved victorious, witnessed the meeting between the two brothers. The parley was tense and ultimately fruitless. Stannis offered Renly one final chance to acknowledge him as the rightful king, even offering to make Renly his heir and restore him as Master of Laws. Renly refused, mocking his brother and pointing out that his 100,000 men made him the real power in the realm, regardless of what the law said. When Catelyn tried to broker peace, reminding them of their common enemy in the Lannisters, both brothers dismissed her concerns. Stannis gave Renly until dawn to submit or be destroyed. That night, as Renly prepared for battle in his tent with Brienne of Tarth and Catelyn Stark present, darkness itself came for him. A shadow with Stannis' face, born from Melisandre's blood magic and Stannis' own life force, materialized in the tent and stabbed Renly through the heart with a shadowy blade. The king died instantly, and the shadow vanished, leaving Brienne and Catelyn as the only witnesses to an impossible murder. When Renly's guards burst in and found him dead with Brienne standing over the body, they assumed she had killed him. She was forced to fight her way out, killing 2 of her sworn brothers of Renly's Rainbow Guard in the process. She and Catelyn fled into the night as chaos erupted throughout Renly's camp. The next morning, when news spread that Renly was dead, most of his army immediately switched their allegiance to Stannis. They were Stormlords after all, and with Renly gone, Stannis was their rightful liege lord. Approximately 15,000 men joined Stannis' cause overnight, swelling his forces to nearly 20,000. However, the crucial Tyrell alliance was broken. Loras Tyrell and the other Reachmen, believing Brienne had murdered Renly and having no reason to support Stannis, withdrew. Stannis now had a real army and a chance to take King's Landing. He sailed up Blackwater Bay with his combined fleet and forces, confident that the city would fall to his assault. The Battle of the Blackwater that followed was the largest single engagement of the War of the Five Kings and would determine the fate of the capital. Stannis' attack began with a massive naval assault, his fleet sailing up the Blackwater Rush to land troops directly at King's Landing's walls. The plan was sound, and initially it seemed to be working. But Tyrion Lannister, serving as Hand of the King in his father's absence, had prepared a devastating surprise. Wildfire, the same substance the Mad King had intended to use to burn the city, was loaded onto a ship and sailed into the middle of Stannis' fleet before being ignited. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. Ships burned with green flame that could not be quenched with water. Sailors leapt into the river only to find the water itself on fire, and hundreds of vessels were destroyed or damaged. The center of Stannis' fleet was annihilated, and his carefully planned naval assault turned into chaos and disaster. But Stannis Baratheon was not a man to give up when victory was within reach. Despite the wildfire catastrophe, he pressed the attack, leading his men personally in an assault on the city walls. At one point, he was among the first to reach the walls, fighting unarmored when his armor had been damaged, inspiring his men through sheer determination and courage. The battle hung in the balance, with Stannis' forces actually breaching the walls and fighting through the streets of King's Landing. The turning point came when Lord Tywin Lannister arrived with the armies of the Westerlands, having made a forced march from Harrenhal. Even more crucially, he brought with him the forces of House Tyrell, the very same army that had supported Renly only weeks before. The Tyrells had made a deal with the Lannisters. Margaery would marry King Joffrey instead of being widowed and forgotten, and House Tyrell would join the fight against Stannis. Caught between the walls of King's Landing and the fresh armies of Tywin and the Tyrells, Stannis' forces were routed. Thousands died or were captured. His fleet was destroyed, and his hopes of taking the throne by storm were shattered. Stannis himself barely escaped with his life, retreating back to Dragonstone with the remnants of his army, perhaps 1,500 men in total. The defeat at the Blackwater was devastating for Stannis, but it did not break him. He remained convinced of the righteousness of his claim and determined to continue the fight, even as his forces dwindled and his situation grew increasingly desperate. The death of Renly haunted him, a kinslaying that he had allowed even if he had not wielded the blade himself, and Melisandre's influence over him only grew stronger. In the aftermath of the Blackwater, the War of the Five Kings continued to rage. Though Stannis Baratheon was no longer a major player in the Southern Theatre, he remained on Dragonstone, brooding and planning, burning those he deemed traitors to Arolla as sacrifices at Melisandre's urging. His wife Selyse and the Red Priestess wielded increasing influence, even as Stannis' most loyal advisor, Davos Seaworth, grew more concerned about the dark path his king was following. In King's Landing, the Baratheon dynasty of Robert's line was rapidly approaching its end, though few realized it yet. Joffrey's reign as king was mercifully brief and spectacularly disastrous. His cruelty, his poor judgment, and his sadistic nature alienated even his own family. When he married Margaery Tyrell in a lavish ceremony intended to cement the Lannister-Tyrell alliance, he would not survive to consummate the marriage. During the wedding feast, Joffrey was poisoned, dying horribly in front of the assembled nobility, choking and clawing at his throat as the poison did its work. The crown passed to Joffrey's younger brother Tommen, a gentle boy utterly unsuited for the harsh realities of ruling Westeros. Tommen was crowned as Tommen I and married to Margaery Tyrell, but he was king in name only. Real power rested with his mother Cersei, his grandfather Tywin until his death, and the various factions vying for control in King's Landing. The War of the Five Kings wound down without Tommen ever leading an army or making any significant decisions. Meanwhile, in the north, Stannis Baratheon had made a fateful decision. Responding to a plea for help from the Night's Watch, he sailed north to the Wall with most of his remaining forces. At the battle beneath the Wall, Stannis' cavalry smashed into the wildling army of Mance Rayder, saving the Watch and earning the gratitude of Jon Snow and the Black Brothers. It was Stannis' finest moment, a selfless act of heroism that seemed to validate Melisandre's belief in him as the chosen one. From the Wall, Stannis launched a campaign to win the North to his cause, offering to legitimize Jon Snow and make him Lord of Winterfell in exchange for his support. When Jon refused, Stannis turned to the northern mountain clans and other houses, gradually building a new northern army. He liberated Deepwood Motte from the Ironborn and began a march on Winterfell, held by House Bolton. But the north was not kind to Stannis Baratheon. A fierce blizzard struck his army as it moved through the Wolfswood, and progress slowed to a crawl. Men died of cold and starvation, horses froze to death, and morale plummeted. Stannis' forces, which had once numbered several thousand, dwindled day by day. In his desperation, and driven by Melisandre's insistence that a sacrifice was needed, Stannis made the decision that would damn him forever in the eyes of history. He burned his daughter Shireen alive as a sacrifice to Aralla. Shireen Baratheon was an innocent child, Stannis' only offspring and his heir. She was afflicted with grayscale as an infant, but had survived and was a sweet, intelligent girl who loved books and learning. Her execution by burning was an act of such monstrous cruelty that even Stannis' most loyal followers abandoned him. Half his army deserted during the night after Shireen's death, and even his wife Selyse, who had supported Melisandre's influence, hanged herself in grief and horror. The battle in the ice that followed was a disaster. Stannis' depleted forces were ambushed and destroyed by Ramsay Bolton's army, which knew the terrain and had the advantage of surprise. Stannis' army was annihilated, his dreams of the throne dying in the snow and ice of the north. Stannis himself survived the battle, but was found wounded and alone in the woods by Brienne of Tarth, who had spent years searching for an opportunity to avenge Renly's death. She confronted Stannis about his brother's murder, and Stannis, defeated and broken, did not deny his guilt. Brienne executed him in Renly's name, ending the life of the man who had perhaps the strongest legal claim to the Iron Throne, but had destroyed himself through ambition, religious fanaticism, and ultimately filicide. Back in King's Landing, the Baratheon line came to its final end in tragedy. After Cersei's schemes resulted in the destruction of the Great Sept of Baelor with wildfire, killing hundreds, including Margaery Tyrell and the High Sparrow, young King Tommen could not bear the guilt and sorrow. He walked to his window and stepped through it, falling to his death in the courtyard below. With his death, House Baratheon of King's Landing was extinct, and Cersei Lannister claimed the Iron Throne for herself. The complete extinction of House Baratheon seemed assured. All three of Robert's supposed children were dead, revealed to have been bastards born of incest. Stannis was dead, executed for kinslaying and child murder. Renly was dead, killed by shadow magic before he could father any heirs. The great house that had been founded by Orys Baratheon during Aegon's conquest, that had served the Targaryens faithfully for 3 centuries and then overthrown them to claim the throne, appeared to have come to an ignoble end. But Robert's legacy lived on in ways that even he had never known. Throughout the 7 kingdoms, Robert's bastards survived, the children he had fathered in brothels and bedchambers from dawn to the wall. There was Edric Storm, born of a noble woman and actually acknowledged by Robert. There was Maya Stone, who worked in the Eyrie, and there was Gendry, a common-born boy apprenticed to a smith in King's Landing, who had no idea he was the son of a king. When Daenerys Targaryen eventually came to Westeros with her dragons and her armies, seeking to reclaim the Iron Throne her father had lost, she found herself needing allies among the great houses. After the defeat of the Night King and his army of the dead, in recognition of Gendry's service in the Long Night, Daenerys legitimized him as Gendry Baratheon and named him Lord of Storm's End. Thus, House Baratheon was reborn, not through the line of kings, but through a bastard boy who had rowed a boat, who had forged weapons, who had fought the dead and survived. Whether this new incarnation of House Baratheon would flourish or fade remained to be seen, but the ancient fortress of Storm's End once again had a Baratheon lord, and the crown black stag flew over the castle that had weathered every storm for thousands of years. The legacy of House Baratheon is a complex one, filled with both triumph and tragedy. From Aerys Baratheon's founding of the house through conquest and honor, through 3 centuries of loyal service to the Dragon Kings, to Robert's rebellion and the brief, chaotic dynasty that followed, House Baratheon exemplified both the best and worst of Westeros' nobility. They were warriors without peer, defenders of the realm, who held Storm's End against starvation and broke the Iron Fleet in naval combat. They were also flawed and human, capable of terrible mistakes and monstrous acts. Robert's failure as a king, drinking and whoring, while the realm fell into debt. Stannis' willingness to burn his own daughter in pursuit of a throne. Renly's ambition that led him to usurp his brother's rightful claim. Each brother represented different aspects of power and its corrupting influence. Yet through all their failures and tragedies, the Baratheons never lacked for courage. When Robert faced Rhaegar at the Trident, when Stannis held Storm's End through starvation, when even young Shireen faced the flames with more courage than most knights could muster, the fury of House Baratheon burned bright. Ours is the fury was not merely a house motto, but a statement of fact, a description of the storm that raged in Baratheon blood. The story of House Baratheon reminds us that greatness and tragedy are often inseparable, that the qualities that make someone a magnificent warrior may make them a poor king, that ambition and duty can pull a person in opposing directions until they tear themselves apart. It reminds us that houses rise and fall, that dynasties are born and die, and that the wheel of power in Westeros never stops turning, crushing those beneath it with equal indifference to their nobility or their rights. As we close this chapter of history, we remember the black stag on its field of gold, crowned and fierce, symbol of a house that shaped the 7 kingdoms for better and worse. From the last storm to the long night, from the Ruby Ford to the snows beyond the wall, the Baratheons left their mark on every corner of Westeros. And as long as Storm's End stands against the fury of Shipbreaker Bay, as long as stories are told of Robert's hammer and Stannis' endurance and the might of the Stormlands, House Baratheon will not be forgotten. And so, my dear adventurers, we've journeyed through the complete history of House Baratheon, from legendary foundations to tragic fall and possible rebirth. We've walked the halls of Storm's End, fought in the waters of the Trident, laid siege to King's Landing, and marched through the snows of the north. We've witnessed the fury that gave the house its motto, the ambition that raised them to the throne, and the flaws that brought them low. The tale of the Black Stag is one of the most compelling in all of Westeros' long history, a reminder that power is fleeting, that righteousness does not guarantee victory, and that the greatest warriors do not always make the wisest kings. It's a story of brothers divided by ambition, of love lost and kingdoms won, of children paying for the sins of their fathers and fathers damning themselves for dreams of crowns. I hope this journey through the centuries has brought these legendary figures to life for you, that you could feel the salt spray of Storm's End on your face, hear the clash of Robert's hammer against Rhaegar's armor, sense the cold determination of Stannis grinding his teeth as he contemplates impossible choices. These are the stories that make Westeros what it is, the threads of history that weave together to create the rich fabric of this world. So until our next adventure together, may you dream of mighty fortresses that defy even gods, of warriors whose fury shapes the fate of kingdoms, and of the eternal truth that in the Game of Thrones, you win or you die, but the songs endure forever. Sleep well, dear friends, and may your own storms be weathered with the courage of House Baratheon. Remember to like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Lawkeeper for more deep dives into the lore and legends of your favorite fantasy worlds. Until next time, sweet dreams and good night.